But what are you doing with this when you've done that a little filming of me? You doing it for?
Alright. I think that should be it. Oh, shit. And now we can begin. How are you? I'm very good, sir, and you?
Great, yeah.
Good. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, good morning.
You used to being on camera?
Have I?
Yeah.
About 18 months ago, we finished filming a film which is about to come out, which was filmed around this area. I had a middle-sized part in it. It was made by a local bloke who's, I don't know where he got the money, but he's wanted to make a film all his life. He'd only be, I don't know, he might be in his 40s, I imagine. I mean, I think they did some magic things that I haven't seen yet in the production, because a few of the things in the clips I saw sure didn't happen when I was there. Buildings catching fire and all that sort of stuff. And that's about the third film I've been in, and the biggest part I've had in those 3 films. So yes, I'm sort of rather used to, well, almost used to being in front of a camera.
I was 20 and I was at the Gaslight Hotel on Crown Street in Surrey Hills, and I was with my cousin and a group of our friends, and we were all skating, and it was probably maybe 1 in the morning or something, and we were all drinking cranberry juice because we weren't drinking, I don't know why. And then this group of people, couple of women and a kooky little guy came over and approached us, and they started talking and asking us questions, and they said they were casting a film. The director was like a huge fan of Gus Van Sant, and he was trying to cast a group of actors that were non-actors that had an existing kind of relationship and that were skaters and that could surf, and we were all those things, and we ended up going through this casting process and making this film together. All the friends were cast in the film. They'd been trying to cast this film for like a year and just hadn't found the group of friends that they wanted to use, and they found us, and then we all spent 8 weeks, or well, you know, more than that, rehearsing, but 8 weeks shooting the film. He ran out of money about halfway through, and it was like a no-budget feature. And we all liked the script. The script was like super unusual, but really interesting. And, we all liked it. But yeah. I hated the film. Like, the director wouldn't show us a cut until the end. Until it was finished, until he was screening it in front of a theatre full of people. We screened it at the Academy Twin on Oxford Street in Paddington, and it was filled with, you know, directors and friends and family, and everyone was really excited, and we were sitting in the middle of the theatre, and it started, and I think about 20 minutes in, I just like burst into tears and ran out of the theatre, and found it really confronting. I think he just had to compromise too often on too many things. It's got a bit of a cult following, the film. It was the first, so it was this story of a young surfer in a small town discovering his sexuality, and all of these kind of like bizarre little small town circumstances. There were elements of like surreal weirdness. What was the question?
So basically, it's the idea. Basically the idea is sort of to get interesting characters around the Maitland area, and interview them. That's sort of
In Maitland,
around Maitland.
if I've seen interesting houses.
No. This project, mine, is to interview interesting characters around Maitland.
To introduce me.
To interview interesting characters, interesting people, like yourself.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, that's sort of what the idea is.
That's what it... Well, I know what it's for.
Yeah.
More or less, yeah. And, well, you want me to start? I mean...
So we'll go back. We'll go way back. What is your earliest memory?
My earliest memory is being at a festival and purchasing, harassing my mother to purchase miniature cooking pots, earthenware cooking pots in Sri Lanka, where I grew up, and then going home and sitting down on the floor while my mother cooked on an open fire.
My earliest memory, I grew up in Cobar, in far western New South Wales. So my earliest memory of very hot summers, walking to school with a big straw hat and going past the Chinese garden called Ma Mong's Garden that we weren't allowed to go into because there was a big well, and wandering in to have a look, hoping I'd run into a Chinese person.
Tearing apart a red geranium and being fascinated by the colour. And I was pretty young because I was still wearing nappies and I was prelingual, so I could understand that people were talking to me, but I couldn't respond. But I just remember being absolutely blown away by the colour red and the idea that one red geranium, if you pulled it apart, became many.
And did you continue this pulling apart?
Of geraniums. Yeah, no, it's compulsive. No, I do like flowers, but I don't really have the patience to grow them. But I think it's interesting that you find your calling, or you get an inkling of your calling pretty young if you listen to those people's stories, because for me, I was always fascinated by colour and image. And it's interesting to me that one of my earliest memories should be about colour. So eventually I'd go on and I'd train as a painter. That was my first degree.
I was very young, and I must have been reading The Adventures of Tom Sawyer or The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I remember reading another book called Pudd'nhead Wilson as well that Mark Twain wrote. That was very good. And I must have been like, oh, Huckleberry Finn this, oh, Huckleberry Finn that, oh, la, la, la. Oh, Tom Sawyer and all this. Then one day I must have been doing something and my mother turned around and she said, you're just like Huckleberry Finn. Of course, I must have been something good that I was doing, not bad. I was an angelic child. And it stuck. But I've lost it for a lot of years. And then I went on the American Queen, which is a beautiful paddle steamer on the Mississippi. And I did a 10-night cruise through Tennessee and Mississippi and down to Louisiana. And it was absolutely brilliant. And I was like, okay, definitely I'm Huckleberry Finn. I just sat out there in the rocking chair out on the deck, and I had a straw hat that I cut off and it was all worn. I had cut off jeans. I had a rope for a belt, and I sat on the front deck, and people I met on the cruise even bought me a corncob pipe because they said, oh, you can't be Huckleberry Finn without a corncob pipe. And that was like, yep, this is home to me. It was a place that I'd ever felt the most comfortable in. So, and I always thought I was going to be Peter Pan, the boy who never grew up and could fly and do magical things. No, just Huckleberry Finn, sitting on the river in his rocking chair, watching the world go by. That's pretty good.
I think up until I was about 12, I had a pretty good sense of self or feeling about myself. But things started to change. I don't know whether it was to do with hormones, what it was to do with, but anyway. As I headed into my teenage years, I started feeling very insecure and lacked self-esteem and thought I wasn't attractive and all this stuff, you know. And I think part of all of those negative feelings about myself, I just decided that I was fat. I wasn't overly fat at all. I was probably roundish, but it was also the time of Twiggy, and it was 1970, 71, and it was very, very, the magazines were showing stick figures, you know, and I guess I was affected by that, and I thought that I needed to lose weight. So I started to diet. I think I remember going out one day and I had shorts and long socks on, and some friend of a friend, male, said something like, "Oh, you look like a footballer," and I took it as though he was saying, "Oh, you've got big legs." I think he just meant I was dressed like a footballer, but anyway, I decided I had to go on a diet. And I went to extremes with it, I guess, and because my parents were working, I was able to basically starve myself, and I lost a lot of weight, and I lost a lot of weight fairly quickly. It's interesting because I felt great about it. I didn't see myself as being too thin. I still thought I needed to lose weight. And so I kept going, and I guess I got sick and ended up having to be taken to hospital. And fortunately, I got better. I mean, it didn't go so far that I ended up with years and years and years of close to death's door or anything, but I did. No, it was just difficult. I was just doing this outrageous sort of exercising every day. I was just so focused on my looks, my appearance, and it was just crazy stuff, really. But and you know, if I ate more than an apple, some days I thought that I was letting myself down. And anyway, I did get through that after about, I suppose, it was less than a year. I was lucky. I turned around. I remember the day it turned around because I'd collapsed at school and I'd come home and I'd gone to bed, and my mother brought in this white bread sandwich with tomato and butter. And it was like, and I thought, no way. But she left it there. She didn't push it or anything. She just left it beside my bed, and I kept looking at it. And I knew. I remember thinking, if I eat that, this is the end of this, you know, thin journey. don't know that I looked at it like thin journey, but I knew it was the end of that era. And I ate the sandwich. I was 19 when I came to Australia. I migrated to Australia. So I had 19 years of cooking with my mother, which was lovely. So it was the foundation for all things good about food. What was seasonal, what was fresh, how to blend spices, how to, you know, the combination of the various spices, so bringing in your base spices of dry spices of coriander and cumin and fennel
and pepper and cardamom and cinnamon, cloves, how you add aromatics to a base spice and how you make this gorgeous spice blend. You transform dry spices into something quite incredible. So she was quite a master at blending spices. And we grew up with spices because my father used to dabble, be a short part-time, I guess, spice trader. And he brought all these exotic spices home, and we used to sleep surrounded by these beautiful smells.
Most of my heritage is actually English and Irish, but the colour that you see, and they're the features you see, that is my father's family. That's mixed race America, South American. So it's Brazil, Portugal and Afro-American. So we grew up with my father. We never met one of his relatives, and I still haven't, but my sister has. He never spoke about it. He was clearly estranged from his family. We knew the connection was in South America, and he changed his name. So it's been a long, and I think my sister spent about 10 years on it, and she has found his family. In fact, he had a twin brother. He had 11 siblings, and they weren't all that far away, the ones that were in this country. And we hadn't really thought of them as being, we knew we had that mixed race gene. So, but when you think back, it explains lots of things that he used to bring us home black dolls when he went to Sydney, and he'd just give us the doll. No conversation, no further thing. But at the time, I think we were probably the only children around that had black dolls. And they were lovely. We loved them just as we loved everything else. But he never really spoke about it. And I'm still not sure what the falling out was. But and my sister probably, through meeting all this family, probably will. But it doesn't really matter. I think it's just a bit sad that we couldn't have found them and brought them together earlier before he died, so that it ended differently. But anyway, that can't happen. It's all over.
My background is in Sri Lanka, we're a minority called Burghers. So our ancestors were Portuguese or Dutch or British, and because of colonisation, so Sri Lanka was colonised in 1505 by the Portuguese, about 100 years later by the Dutch, and about 100 years later by the British. Sri Lanka got independence in 1958, and so English was my first language because my ancestors were Portuguese and Dutch, and I was allowed to go to school and study in English. But in 1972, I think, or 71, there was a change of government, and the language for all Burghers included was going to be Sinhalese, which is the native language of Sri Lanka, or the main language, and there's Tamil as well. And if you couldn't speak either of those, then you were in a minority, and you couldn't really go to university because everything was being taught, unless you learned Sri Lankan. And I can speak Sinhalese, but it's not good enough for me to, at the time, to be able to be educated at university. So my parents decided that the best thing to do was to migrate because of the lack of opportunities economically and academically, to migrate to Australia.
Greetings, good upon you. Let me introduce myself. My name is the not-so-reverend George Augustus Longshanks, known in the history books as the Giant for the Lord Hallelujah. Fire and brimstone preacher, that was my vocation. But today I'm going to talk a little bit of history. Maitland on Hunter's River, try and visualise the Hunter Valley as it was, a primeval rainforest, almost impenetrable, full of cedar trees, magnificent eucalyptus trees on the higher ground anyway. 400 million years ago, the sandstone plains were uplifted. Underneath the sandstone, if you go back even further, was the forest, which eventually rotted away and formed the coal measures, what they call the South Maitland coal field. And a lot of wealth has been made from coal over the years. So as well as the farming and the coal, we had civilization come. When the convicts arrived just over 200 years ago now. In fact, Maitland on Hunter's River is just about 200 years this year. And what a shame we're not really celebrating that, or commiserating it, depends on your outlook.
Do you have a sort of do you remember the moments where you sort of discovered this sort of type of lifestyle?
I think I was introduced to it by my great uncle, who was not really my uncle, but I remember as a kid, they always had these beautiful parties and entertained a lot, and that was like, oh, I love this. This is really good. And then probably what sparked it even more was, I discovered the Titanic. Well, I didn't discover it, but I first read about it when I was about 6 and went, oh, wow, this is amazing. And then that introduced me to all the other great ocean liners and how, all about first class, which was like, oh, this is where I was meant to be, in first class. All these beautiful things and beautiful clothes, beautiful people. And then, of course, that in architecture, I've always been drawn to all the grand houses, not necessarily all the workers' cottages, but all the grand houses and beautiful furniture and china and silver and all that. So that's where I've kind of that's where that influence has come in. But it's very early influence. Yeah, probably by the time I was about 12 or 13, I had it set in my mind what I liked and what I didn't like. So that was very early. So, I've pursued it ever since.
A lot of pressure gets heaped on young people when they're doing the year 12 to pretty much define their life trajectory in 6 months. And so I had a lot of options about what I could have done, but I made a big paper dice, and I wrote down all my favourite options on the dice, and I just rolled it a few times. But I kind of cheated because I kept rolling until I got out of school.
I started off as an artificial limb and appliance maker after I left school. I didn't know what I wanted to be. I still don't. I've retired now. I started off making artificial limbs for returned servicemen, but that meant I had to be in Sydney, and I detest cities, and Sydney falls into that category. It's a good place for a holiday, but you wouldn't live there if you were sane.
I was in Maitland. I went to Lingnuel School from year 5, and I finished my studies there, and then I moved to Sydney when I was 17.
What was your thoughts of Maitland at that time?
I don't have like negative memory associations. I just knew it was not necessarily where I needed to be. It's conservative. I would always kind of wear funny hats and you know, more or less terrorised in the mall behind us growing up at times. Just conservative, cranky kids. Lots of homophobia. I always experienced, I guess, because I have always been like pretty comfortable and in touch with my more feminine energies, but I haven't had male partners. But I just remember kids just kind of really getting angry that I was really different, and I always would find myself really confused by that, I guess.
My sister was living in Melbourne. She was married at the time, so we moved to Melbourne, to a suburb called Caulfield, and and we started life there. I started off. My two younger sisters, whom I migrated with at the time, went to school, and I looked for a job. So I had done about 3 months after I finished school in an advertising agency in Sri Lanka. So I decided that I really wanted to have a career in marketing. So I looked for jobs in sales, in sales and marketing, advertising, and I was lucky enough to, after quite a while, to get a job in sale in the advertising department of a large department store called Buckley and Nunn, no longer there. It's now, I think, got absorbed by David Jones at some point.
I decided to study nursing and went to Sydney Hospital, and that was just a really, really difficult experience because it was more authoritarianism and really archaic. Here we were learning to be nurses in a very strict, structured environment, and being thrown in the deep end. And I found it was a difficult place to start a career because the assumption was you had confidence, or that you were able to work effectively by yourself. And I remember being on a ward of 17 people, and everyone went out for a smoker, someone fell out of bed, I was given the responsibility of writing reports, and I had to do all sorts of things without any formal training, including suctioning lungs and putting tubes down people's throats, and I had nightmares, so I left nursing.
I decided to go nursing, and I was nursing for only a few weeks when somebody died, and I hadn't figured into the equation that anyone would die. I'd gone there to help people, make them better, and I was absolutely shocked, and I think it's one of the couple of things that shaped my life from then on. I realised that you do live and you do die, and there's a very small window, and you shouldn't waste it. So that was a big shock to me for that lady to die. I hadn't been nursing for very long, and she was a lovely lady, and I was very attached to her, and I had no idea that she was that sick she was going to die. So I guess when I finished my general training, I went to Sydney and worked in paediatric intensive care at Prince of Wales Hospital, where small babies die, because I decided I had to get used to it, think a little bit more about this, that we don't all live forever, and some don't live for very long at all.
Anyway, fast track, I ended up going to Teachers College at Goulburn, and I liked being back in the country. And what I really loved about Goulburn most of all was the camaraderie between all the people who were there to study teaching. And there was all community housing within the town, and living in the old houses and just sharing picnics and bands and going out at night and just having fun, really. Study didn't really come into it much, I have to admit, but I somehow managed to get through college too. And I suppose I've met at college my main friends, a group of a few women who, you know, I've always met up with over the last 35, 40 years since then, which is nice. Yeah, so college was fun. When everyone left, I decided not to leave because I thought I'd found home, and everyone then left, and it wasn't quite the same because the college then became the police academy, and although there was still a remaining structure on the premises of the Teachers College for an art school, which I attended, it was just like 2 rooms and surrounded by the police academy, which was a real... what's the word? I can't think of the word, but anyway, you'd be doing art and you'd hear them out marching, you know, left, right. And I had to have we had to have badges to come in now with our name tags, and I even had to have one for my dog and all this sort of stuff. Anyway.
Then I went teaching after I'd gone to Teachers College. And it was when I went to Mittagong as a teacher that I joined the local theatre group and formed some good friendships there. And one of the chaps in it said, would I direct a show? Now, even if you don't think so now, when I was back then, I was fairly shy and I was reluctant to do it. Anyway, they twisted my arm and I said, okay, and it was the importance of being earnest.
So you were in, was it like so it was a professional acting class?
Full-time, yeah, acting college, yeah. And I did 2 years of the 3-year course. Yeah, the thing I loved most about training to be an actor was learning. I always felt like it was really valuable because it's learning about you, learning about the way your body works and the way that affects the way you feel, and the way that you feel affects your body. And it just was a really neat introspective, you know, like how do I work in everyday life? And you have to know that in order to paint different pictures, tell different stories with your body, with your voice, with, you know, the feelings that you have. So I felt like the training was really, really very valuable. But maybe I was a little bit impatient to like get out into the world and do different things, and I didn't actually finish. I did 2 years and then I didn't do the 3rd year.
When you're young, you don't appreciate education. It's just something that's given to you. But when you are faced with the prospect of losing something that you really, really want, you suddenly realise you have to work for it. And so I was doing all sorts of grotty jobs to pay to keep myself at art school, and I loved it. I pretty much was living in the life drawing room because I was, at the time, a lot of my work was figurative. So yeah. And so I worked really hard. And also, a sense of claustrophobia informs a lot of upbringings in isolated areas. And for me, I saw that education as a way out. So I thought, if I work hard now, this is my ticket to the world. And in a way it was, because I worked very hard. I got a substantial body of work together. I was able to approach a commercial gallery when I left, and I had an exhibition, and it was boom time, so that exhibition all sold out. But more importantly, I was able to get into the Royal College of Art in London, which is where I'd always wanted to study. And so I went over there and I did a master's degree in painting.
But I did 2 years at college and got through, and they sent me out to teach delinquent boys at Mittagong. Boys who had all been through the courts, and it was called the Toombong Training School for Boys, Mittagong. And I remember getting my appointment somewhat late, and I thought, where the hell's Mittagong and what's Toombong? Because I'd never actually been. I might have been to Wollongong, but I've certainly never been south of Sydney down the Southern Highlands. And Mittagong's a lovely spot, and I spent 7 or 8 years there. And I taught at that school till 71. And I thought, well, if I'm going to stay teaching it was made painfully clear by the department that if you and I went for a job, the same job, and we had the same experience, and you had a degree and I didn't, you would get the job. Didn't matter about the quality of your teaching, you would get the job because you had a degree. And I thought, oh well, I suppose I better think about getting a degree. I don't think I'm bright enough to get a degree, but I looked around me and most of the other fellows on the staff were doing degrees through Armidale. And I thought, well, if that drongo can get one, I can get one. So I applied to Sydney Uni to do full-time. I applied to every uni in Sydney, to do full-time arts. To this day, I've only heard from Sydney University. None of the others even answered my inquiry. And I thought Sydney University was then and the hardest one to get into.
The building that we were in at the time at the Royal College for the painting students was never supposed to be for painting studios. It was actually supposed to be an art gallery, but they'd partitioned it off. And so we had these little white wall cubicles with this immaculate polished floorboards underneath. And so we'd trash the floor because there was paint everywhere. And then each year they'd redo the floor. So it was kind of this incredible cycle of creation and destruction.
But my real interest was really in being part of an advertising agency. So I saw a job advertised as a Girl Friday in a large advertising agency called John Clemenger, and I went to work there as a Girl Friday. And so they, I did indicate that I was interested in getting my degree in marketing. So the agency I was very fortunate that they sponsored me to do my degree in marketing, and so I ended up with a Bachelor of Business with a major in marketing, which has held me in good stead really, because I've then had many marketing and advertising positions. But in all of that time, I always cooked for family, friends, had lots and lots of dinner parties, and people would come to dinner. And I was really keen to learn a lot about Western cooking and how to make a roast and how to cook chips and all that sort of thing. But because I thought that was really important as being part of the Australian, culture and learning all about, to be Australian. And so for about 10 years, I didn't cook any Sri Lankan food. People used to come to dinner and be appalled that they would be served a lamb roast. And they said, oh, no, not curry. We thought we were getting curry. So I realised that people really did like that. And I did have a particular liking and I just loved cooking them. So I thought, well, really, I should be cooking them.
At the end of arts, I thought, I haven't got science, I haven't got maths, I have got anthropology, I have got government. What else can I ask them can I do? Laws. Now, my father was a lawyer, my brother who went out of school straight into law, and my sister had gone out of school like me, teaching first and then switched across to law, then theology, of all things. And I got through that eventually, and I got a job in Castle Hill, which I loathed. And after about 9 months, the guy who ran the firm came and said, oh, I want you to leave. God, what have I done? I said, what's wrong? Is it my work or something like that? And he didn't answer the question. And I just picked up my few books and things I had and went home. And I found out afterwards I was keeping the chair warm for a friend of his, and I was just a temporary filling a gap until this friend's son or whoever it was came along. Well, that was all right. I didn't like it anyway, because in the 9 months I was there, I think he might have spoken to me in total for half an hour.
By the time I graduated with a master's, I was 21. So in some ways, a lot of those pressures just kind of was like water off the duck's back, because I wasn't really old enough to kind of perceive them, I think, or let them bother me or whatever. So I left and I needed a studio, and in an accidental moment of extreme hipness, I ended up working alongside Damien Hirst and a lot of the young British artists who had had studios at a big studio complex in South London in Brixton. And it was a derelict space, but it was cheap and it was large. And a landlord wasn't that keen on collecting rent because I think he liked the bragging rights of, you've got some quite famous artists working there, and you've got to tell people something at parties, I suppose. So I worked there, and then I decided it was good to save money, so I moved into my studio and I actually lived there for a year, which most people would tell you was quite a stupid thing to do, and they'd be quite right. Because it was a very sort of high crime area, I suppose, and quite derelict, and there weren't things like showers or there was no kitchen. There was a toilet, and we used to hotwire the electricity off the trains. This was not my thing. Somebody had set it up before I moved there, but we got free electricity because I'd worked out a way of getting the power from a nearby railway and using it to power all our lights. But London Electricity came storming in at one point and turned all the power off, and then at the same time the toilet blocked up. So at that point in time there was no electricity, no heat, couldn't cook, and there was no loo either. So I actually went to stay with some friends in Scotland while it all got sorted out. So. I remember that when the electricity got switched off, as a short-term measure, the landlord brought in a generator, and they were powering the studio's off this little generator. And one of my friends was in his studio working one night, and he had the generator on, and the cord ran across his studio, and he was using it to get the lights up. And all of a sudden there was this, and the cord came whipping out of the wall and went flying off through the door, and he heard a and then an enormous bang. And this was kind of startling, because what had happened is somebody had brought the car into the studio complex, loaded up the generator in the back of their car, and then rammed the security gates to get out again. These were big gates, they were pretty solid metal, and just driven pretty much straight through them in a stolen vehicle. So it was pretty entertaining on a number of different levels. I certainly wouldn't be doing that now, but yeah, at the time it was kind of normal. And I always remember that the rats were, they were amazing. They were pretty much the size of small cats, and they had these orange fleas on them as well. And they had no fear, these rats. They were kind of like, they'd gone over that line between human and animal, and they were preparing to take over the world. And yeah, I bought a cat to try and keep the rats at bay, and the cat was scared of the rats, and I can't say I blame him. And then I stayed living in the UK until, I think, 99. And then I got a really nice email from Robin Archer, who was that year's director of the Adelaide Festival. And she said, would you like to come and do an exhibition as part of the festival? And also, could I please use one of your paintings as the festival poster image? When it came to looking for a way to get back to Australia for the festival exhibition, we answered this ad in a yachting magazine to crew a catamaran from the Canary Islands to Sydney. And that was interesting as well, because that boat ended up getting shipwrecked. And so we ended up getting picked up by a Brazilian oil tanker and arriving back in Australia via New Zealand. So we literally lost everything that we had at that point. And I remember the stress of having this exhibition for the festival coming up, and it was a big deal. It's a really good festival, and it was, it's one of those things that potentially next levels your career. So I really wanted to do a good job for it, but I was running out of time. We didn't necessarily have anywhere to live, and we'd lost all this stuff. So I just remember the deadline coming like a wall towards me, and trying to create under pressure is sometimes not that much fun.
Did you end up succeeding or not?
It wasn't a very good show, I've got to say.
Good upon you. The not-so-Reverend George Augustus Longshanks here again. This time we're talking about Maitland, the port of Maitland actually. A lot of people don't realise that Maitland City, certainly the older part here on the river, was a port. They called it Port Maitland. Maitland really took off because there was land available. Well, Molly Morgan, virtually the founder of Maitland in many ways, Molly Morgan had 50 acres, basically from about here all the way down to the other end of the commercial area. So the whole of central Maitland was basically owned by Molly Morgan, and it developed as a commercial centre, being close to the river. In the 1850s, there was a partnership formed, Wolf and Gorick, and they took over this warehouse that was built in the 1850s, and it became a very large general merchant's business in the busy river port, Port Maitland. There was one occasion, it was a bit amusing, because cattle used to be driven up and down the main street here to the sale yards up there at Campbell's Hill. One day one of the cows decided to have a look inside Wolf and Gorick's store in the haberdashery section where all the ladies were. The ladies apparently made a very quick exit, screaming and yelling. The gentlemen that were in the other section, like where the ironmongery etc. was, came to the rescue and eventually, after some difficulty, got the cow out of the shop. I hope it didn't leave too much mess on the floor, and they got back to business. So that was one of the more amusing events that occurred in the history of the old Wolf and Gorick merchant's store. Thank you.
I was in a relationship for 12 years. The last 3 years were married. We built a big guest house that I designed, and we built it on the outskirts of Lithgow, and we ran that from 1999 to 2001. And before that, I saved an old theatre in Lithgow. We started that in 1993, and that went through to 1999. We had a cafe in the front of the theatre. We had an antique shop in the grounds of the theatre. We had a real estate office as well, and we had the bed and breakfast. So by the late 90s, we were very busy. We had too many businesses on the go. So they pretty much all went, and then we relocated over here to Maitland, mostly to a warmer climate. And Lithgow's it was a bit like being, you've got as big as you can get in the pond, so you have to go and find a bigger pond.
So when you opened your bar in Sydney, how were you?
So it's actually my cousin who opened it. So we drove around together. He had this company, he had this really cool company called the Beer Baron when he was very young. He was a young man. He's always been fairly entrepreneurial, my cousin, and he used to deliver alcohol. So he'd just go to the bottle shop, buy a whole lot of cheap beer, cheap wine, and he would sell alcohol between midnight and 6 a.m. And he was the Beer Baron. And it was like hugely successful and under the radar. It was always like, you get the number from a friend and a friend's friend and a friend's friend. And so I wasn't ever like officially a part of that, but I would, do deliveries with him through the night sometimes, and you'd end up at all these kind of wild parties through the city and all sorts of places. Often brothels. Lots of the brothels in Sydney got onto this concept, and so you'd end up at brothels at 3 and 4 in the morning, and he was championed because, I don't know if you've ever been to a party and the beers run out and all the bottle shops are closed. There was this number that people could call. It was this like, and you'd turn up with a case of beer and everyone would just cheer and be like really like appreciative. Anyway, so that ended up, that kind of like came to a conclusion fairly dramatically. He was running it as a gift basket service, which is completely legal, and working within a legal loophole. But there was a competitor, like a young guy with heaps of cash, that came onto the market and started advertising. And he wasn't doing it legally. He was just illegally selling alcohol between midnight and 6 a.m, trying to compete. And the police and liquor and gaming got onto it, and he was charged, and it was fairly dramatic. And then there was a big ongoing investigation into the beer baron, and ended up being like a big court case, and the police were trying to prosecute my cousin for all of these really significant crimes. And in the end, it was just one of the drivers making one mistake, because there always had to be 2 people, 2 parties. So it's like you're buying the gift basket to give to someone else. And one of the drivers, didn't do that, and it was undercover cop, and he was charged for that. And the magistrate actually changed a piece of legislation and wrote the Beer Baron Act, so people could no longer do what he was doing, which is pretty cool. And then that segued into him having a little bit of money to invest in a new business. And we found this shop, and Jed opened up, and he was there for about a year. I came in and started working with him, and he's like, let's do this together. And I bought into the business, and we ran it for 7 years. 7 years. Yeah. And it's an amazing little bar. Every Monday night, it packs out, and people stand around and sing old songs of the sea shanties and Irish folk songs, and it's also fairly debaucherous and basically a nightclub on any given night of the week. The music gets turned up, and it's either the very best or the very worst music you've ever heard, and there's a smoke machine and lots of public nudity. I think that the public nudity did, like, more often than not, whether I'd like to admit it or not, came from me.
But buying antiques, that was my main objective. When my wife said, I'm not coming back because my daughter's leg takes 15 years to fix. They were in Switzerland. That's why I left Melbourne. You follow that? Yeah, I was working. I had a job in Melbourne, really good job, good money. I bought 2 houses. I had a really good life. But then she said, I'm not coming back. It takes 15 years. When my daughter grows up, you have to stretch the leg a bit more, that sort of thing. And so I didn't. So I said to my wife, all right, I come back to Switzerland. And I had a lot of paintings and antiques and collectibles. I sold a lot and packed up and started to go back to Switzerland, overland, I went back from Melbourne to Adelaide, then I went to the centre, Alice Spring, and went up to, took the plane in Darwin to, what's this island called? That island hopping to Bali, very slowly, just to buy things. And I wanted to make a antique shop in Switzerland. But then after about 2 months, a message came don't come back. It took too long to go back. Took too long. Yeah.